So we're back with hour 2. So a few people have their own database up and running and you're connected to your Azure database or your local. If you haven't, you should be connected to my database through Visual Studio using the credentials that are on Blackboard. So you'll see the GCR Freeman is my server, the database is, and the database name is Contoso. So the way we connect and talk to a SQL database through an ASP.NET application is really quite different from what we're used to. With our PHP applications, they looked something like, we did something like this. We created a little database file where we had a connection line, and anytime we wanted to do any kind of, these are files from last class, actually. Let's see, 11, right? So here was our beer store we built in PHP. When we wanted to build a page to query the database and get some data, we used our database file to connect, and then we would write a query, we would execute it, fetch the results and loop through them. Our way of doing this in ASP.NET is very, very different. We're actually not going to write SQL commands at all. Okay? When we want to display data in a table, we're not going to use a loop. How does this work? We're going to use a tool called Entity Framework. It looks something like this visually. Here's our web application. Here's our SQL database. So we have our Contoso database. Either you have your own or you're connected to mine. We're going to build a new ASP.NET web application. And then we use the Entity Framework. This is a tool. It's called an ORM tool. ORM stands for Object Relationship Mappers. Anybody ever worked with an ORM tool before? Tom, what can you tell us? What have you worked with and how does it work? What is an ORM tool? What does it do?
Well, you use Doctrine with Symfony, something like that. It helps you do like relationship mapping between data, and ones, stuff like that. Helps you write structured queries, avoid rejection.
Okay. Hey, Seth, anything you want to add to that from your experience? So our idea here is we want to have in our C# code, we have 4 tables in our database. Students, we can see our database here. We have students, courses, departments, and enrollments. So what we want to have, and what we used to have to hand code, is we want to have, excuse me. Back in week 2, we talked about objects, that we would typically define objects that relate to things in our application. If we were building an e-commerce site, we'd have things like a customer object, a product object, etc. And we used to have to create all these objects on our own. I think I showed you an example back from a couple weeks ago. So objects that looked something like this. So if we had built a site for a real estate agent that sold houses, we might have classes in our database like a listing class, an image class, all the things that would describe all the data in that application. So we use Entity Framework because it will build all these classes automatically for us. And those classes will automatically contain functions for doing create, read, update, and delete of our data. So we have to write a lot less code than we had to do in PHP. Excuse me. So what I want to do, I'm going to make a new solution for today. I'm going to click File, New. And last week, we created a template. I think I'm going to use that same template. So rather than clicking New Project, I'm going to pick Project from Existing Code. No, that's not the option I want. Sorry, I'm going to cancel that. I will click File, New Project. And I'll click Visual C#. And we exported our week 4 project last week. I'm going to pick my week 4 project. The reason is my week 4 project already has a master page. It already has Bootstrap. So I want to make a new project, but base it on my week 4 project rather than starting from scratch. And I'm going to create this and call it week 6. I'll create a directory for my solution and I'll create a new Git repository. So I'm making a new project based on the project we did 2 weeks ago. So it's going to create a new Visual Studio solution with these pages: hello, tip, site.master, and default. So if I start up, click on Start and Start Without Debugging, I should actually be able to run my project and it will look exactly like the file we created last week, sorry, 2 weeks ago. So here was our little project from a couple weeks ago. So I'm going to change a couple things here. And again, if you don't have the project, you can take the week 4 project off of GitHub. I'm going to go into my site.master. Just close my Server Explorer for a minute. So on line 30 of site.master, where it says week 4, I'm just going to change this to say Contoso University, because our application is going to connect to our Contoso database, and we're going to display and change data in that database. I'm also going to change a couple of my links here. I'm going to take out the link to the lists page. I'm going to have 2 links. I'm going to change hello and tip to say departments and students. And I'm going to change the URLs to go to departments.aspx and students.aspx. So those are the pages we're going to build. We're going to build departments together today in class, and for your lab, you're going to have to build the students page and get it to display student data. I'm going to get rid of the hello page. I'm going to right-click it and delete it. And I'm going to right-click and delete my tip page. We don't need either of those. So I have 2 links to departments and students. And I'm just going to go back to my home page for a minute. Actually, I'll leave that. Leave the home page as it is. I'll actually just change this to say Contoso University instead. So now if I click on my home link, all I've done is change the links and get rid of those 2 pages. There's our home page. And there are links to departments and students. Those links are broken, that's fine. We're going to create a departments page in a minute. So the only files in the application right now will be your default.aspx page, your site.master, and the web.config file. X and have it use your site.master template. So that'll fix this broken link. Where would I go if I want to create a new page with a new page using my master page? How would I do it? Yep, so I'll right-click my project. I'll add. And then where do I go, Priyank? Yep. And I want web form with master page, and I'm going to call this departments. I'll click add. And then it will ask me what master page do I want to use as the template. I'll use my site.master. So now we have a departments page. I'll just put in a title here at the top. Inside my main content, main body, I'll put in an H1 that just says departments. So I haven't written any C# code. We're just creating a new page, putting in a title. Now we need to build our solution. Whenever we add a new file to the project, before we can access that file, we need to build. So I'll build my solution, which succeeded. And now if I click departments, I'll get a department page. So we want to use this page to display this data. We've got 4 departments. Each one has an ID. There's a department ID, a name, and a budget column. So what we want is to create an HTML table that will query our database and display this information. So now we need to get our ASP.NET application talking to our database. And again, if you don't have your own running, you can connect to my database. That's fine for today. So I'm going to go back to I'm going to click on the View menu and go back to my Server Explorer. Right, so we can see here's my database over here. So with our PHP application, we would write this database file where we put in all of our database credentials, and then we would include this file in any PHP page that needed to talk to the database. With Visual Studio, it already has a place to store database connections. If I open up, we haven't used, well, I guess we did use web.config last week for error handling. In here, there will be a place to store our database connection string. But rather than write the connection string ourselves, we're going to let Visual Studio do it for us. So on my week 6 project, I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose Add a New Item. Now in this case, notice I've got Visual C# and it reverts to whatever the last selection was, which was web form with master page. I don't want this option. Instead of choosing web, I'm going to click on data. So click on data, and you should see an option here that says ADO.NET Entity Data Model. Is that in your list when you click data of things you can add to your project? I need to know because you may need to put an add-on into your Visual Studio if you don't see that option. So I'll do that process again. I right-click my project. I choose Add a New Item. And under Visual C#, I choose Data. We want this option here. ADO.NET Entity Data Model. You see it? And then down here, it's going to give a default name of Model 1. Just change that to Contoso Model, the name of our database. Doesn't really matter what name we give it, but we should probably name it something descriptive. And then choose Add. Now this is kind of neat. You should get a box that looks something like this. It says, okay, you want this Visual Studio application to connect to a database. Does the database already exist? If not, Visual Studio, we could actually use it to create the database. But we already have an existing database, so we're just going to connect to that. So what we want is this first option, the EF Designer from database. So I'm just going to leave that first option checked. And I'll click Next. And if I've already connected to the database here, it will say, which connection do you want to use? It's already prompting me for the connection that I've already got created here. With two options. Exclude the sensitive data in the connection string, meaning the username and password. I'll just choose yes. Include it. If you don't see this, just click on New Connection, and then you'll put in the server name, the username, password, and the database name you want to connect to. If you've already connected to your database in Server Explorer, well, Visual Studio already finds that, so you don't have to enter this a second time. And then it's saying, save my connection settings in web.config as Contoso entities. And it shows you what this long connection string is going to look like. Much longer in ASP.NET than it would be in PHP. But Visual Studio will write all this code for us into the file, so we don't have to do it ourselves. So I'm going to click yes, and I'm going to click this Save Connection. So I'll click Next. It'll ask which version we want to use. I think I'll just leave it with the current version. We may have to revert to version 5, but I think version 6 should work. They made a few changes from version 5 to 6. So I'll click Next again. If you only see version 5, that's fine. Just pick version 5. So now it says, okay, what objects from the database do we want to include in this? So if I expand tables and the DBO user, which stands for database owner, I can see all 4 tables. If I just check up here, it automatically checks all 4. So we want all of the tables in our database to be used. And it asks if we want to include the foreign keys. We'll say yes. And I'll just click Finish. So just check off all the tables. And now Visual Studio is going to chug away and think for a few minutes.
So will Visual Studio Code connect to the database automatically when it needs to, then? Or do we do it in PHP? Like
No, we'll see that.
Okay. So it's more automated in that way.
Well, it's taking a little longer than I thought. Hopefully it will. I mean, it can see our database, so that's a good thing.
Mine's just not responding as well.
Mine says no database objects have been selected.
It says no database, so you may have to click the new connection button if your connection wasn't already there. I may have to stop this and try it again. Shouldn't take this long. I'll let it run a little bit longer.
Oh,
Is SQL Server 2014 okay for the course?
Should be. Should be fine.
I hadn't clicked the box.
Okay, well, that didn't go so well. We'll maybe have to give that another try. So if it froze, let's see, I'm going to reopen my week 6 project. Well, we'll try again. I'll right-click my project. I'll add a new item, which is an ADO.NET. Entity data model. So I'm just going to repeat the steps. I may have to pick version 5. I'll just select all my tables. Try one more time with version 6. If not, I'll revert to version 5 and see if that makes a difference. I'm not terribly optimistic. Version 6 is going to work for us. We'll see if version 5 is any better.
We have a message
Oh.
that says the files and save changes in size images, yes to all.
Yes, say yes, because what it's doing is writing the connection string to your web.config file.
And yes to all.
Yes. Okay, so you may get this, running this can harm your computer. I'm just going to say do not show this again and click OK. So we'll look at all the things this little wizard is doing in a minute. It's going to add a whole bunch of references and a whole bunch of files to our project. And then it opens this screen. Now this should look somewhat familiar. What does this kind of look like that you've seen before in a different course? Yeah, it looks like an entity relationship diagram. It's not, but it's based on it. So what we've gotten, it calls this an entity data model. So it allows us within our web application to actually see visually what the database looks like. We can see the tables, we can see the columns, and we can see how the tables are related. Your references also gets expanded, and Visual Studio added some entity framework references. So again, entity framework is the library that lets our ASP.NET application and our SQL Server database talk to each other. Kind of like PDO was the library we used in our PHP class. But there's some other things you're going to notice. Underneath, so here's this file has a .edmx extension. Under here, you'll notice there are now all of these C# files. You may have this closed up, but if you expand it, so if I expand Contoso model EDMX and expand this Contoso model.tt, we now have a course.cs, a department.cs, enrollment and student. If I double click on my department file to open it up, Visual Studio warns us, this file's auto-generated, don't change it. So here it defines a department class. So we have properties of the department object, an ID, which is an integer, a name, which is a string, a budget, which is a decimal. So for each table in our model, Visual Studio auto-generated, when we went through that wizard, it auto-generates a class for each table. Here's our student class with all of the properties of student object. So we used to have to do these things manually. In an old application like this one, these are all the class files. Here, for example, we looked at this a few weeks ago. Here are all the properties and all of the methods. You know, this is one class with 329 lines of code. Guess who wrote all 329 lines of code? If there's any mistake, right? So all of these, so there's how many files in here? So there's about 16 class files, and my team, we had to create all of these manually. Application entity framework, it will auto-generate all of the class files for us. So now we can just start working with them. And if I notice and go to my web.config file, we're now going to see this. There's now a reference to the entity framework. And in here is my database connection string. This is what it looks like. So we're using SQL Server as our database. Here's my host on Azure with my database and my username and password. So rather than us having to create it, when we go through that whole wizard, it will auto-generate the connection string and save it to our web.config file. So Rob, you asked the question, are we going to have to set up a database file and include it? Nope, that wizard does it for us. Yeah, so the web.config is used for any global level, application level variables. We put them in here, right? Like last week, our error handler was global in here. I realize I didn't include our error handling from last week. That's fine. I don't want error handling on here because if we break it, we want to see the error messages so we can fix them. We don't want to go to the error page where we won't know what's wrong. So we added all this stuff. It did one weird thing. Anybody notice from this diagram anything a little bit strange that we might want to fix? Look at the names of the objects in our model.
Took E away.
Yeah, on course, it took the E away. Our table is called courses. It actually removed it. So I want to change that. So if I open up my model and just click the word course and type in an E, and I want to do the same thing here. I want to put it back here and here. If I save my model, notice over here, this should update and it should rebuild that file and put an E on the end of the class.
Is it a problem in departments that it's called courses?
Nope, it's fine. So notice as soon as I change my model, it regenerated this file with the new name. So we're going to use these files, but we don't have to change them. We're just going to work with them as it is. So now I fixed the name and they all say course spelled properly. So now I'm going to go back to my departments page. And what we want is we want to put a table on here that will be connected and display the list of departments. We have 4 records and 3 columns: department ID, name, and budget. And there's 4 departments in the database. Now doing this in ASP.NET, once we have this configured, is so much less code than in PHP. In PHP, we had to do all of this stuff. We needed to execute our query, and we needed to manually build our table and output every row and every column one at a time. Well, way back in 2002, Microsoft came up with this idea. Well, if we're going to build all these server controls that are smart, one of the controls we should give developers is a grid control that we could just drag on and connect that grid up to a query result. So we're going to put on here an ASP grid view. And I'll give it an ID of grid departments. And because this is a server control, we need run at equals server. Don't self-close the tag. Let it write a closing tag, because eventually we're going to put some code in between the opening and closing tag. So we don't want to just close it on open and close it on the same line. So this is almost all the HTML we need. Later we'll add a little more for formatting. Maybe I'll give it a class. We'll use Bootstrap. So we'll assign it a CSS class of table and table striped. We use the same class in our beer store and our PHP application. So if I pulled it up, we want it to look something like this. Let's see. Oh, I don't have the link handy. So now if I click on departments, we still won't get any data. Get a blank page. So now we need to use the entity framework. We want to use our department model to run a find, run a query, and return the data, and then we're going to connect the data up to our grid. So I'm going to go into my code view, my C# code. So on my departments page, I can either click view code from here, so Visual Studio gives us a page load method. We're going to write our own method. Call it expected void. Our method doesn't return anything. We'll write a method called get departments. And it has no input parameters. And when our page loads, we will get the departments and display in the grid view. When our page loads, we could just write the code right in page load. Our code will be more organized if we run our query and display the data in a separate function. So now we need to use all this stuff that the entity framework gave us. We need to use these models and our connection. So before we can write this function, we need to make a couple of references. So at the top, these are some default references. And Rob, you kind of asked about is it like including the database.php file? Kind of. We need any page that's going to talk to our database, we need to add a couple references to the top of that page. So we will add 2 references to access the database. The first one should be this: system.web.model binding. So in order to use the entity framework, we have to make a reference to that. just going to try the other one using week 6 dot. May have to just change. We'll try it just with this one. We may need one other reference, but we'll certainly need that one. System.web.model binding. This allows our web page to use the entity framework to talk to our database. So let's connect to the database. So I'll create a variable called connection. So there's our connection. What is Contoso entities? Well, let's go back to web.config. When we ran that wizard, it created a connection string, and we gave that a name of Contoso entities. So we're just referencing the connection string that got added to our web.config file. So we're creating a new connection using those credentials. I'll create another variable called departments. And we have this kind of shorthand SQL. We don't write full SQL commands when we're working with Entity Framework. We're writing similar commands using a language called LINQ, which is LINQ. I put some references up on Blackboard about LINQ. So here's kind of a sample of what a LINQ query might look like. It looks similar to an SQL query, but there's kind of a shorthand. So we'll work with this over the next few weeks. So if we want to get all the departments, notice when I type con dot, it gives me all of the different class names, courses, departments, and enrollments. So we want to query our departments. And we're just using D as an alias. So this is the SQL equivalent of running a query, select star from departments. But instead of querying the database table directly, we're using our department class that the ADO wizard generated for us. So this department model refers to this here. So this should run a query, select query, and it will give us back a query result stored in a variable called departments. Now, if this was PHP, we would then need code that loops through every department and displays each record and each column. So we'll run the query using LINQ. And now display query result in grid view. This is so much easier. And our C# is separate. It's less code, and it's all separate. Right. So all we have to do here, we created a grid, departments. So we just want to connect the grid to the query result. So I'll type grd departments dot. We want to set the data source of our grid equal to our departments. That's our query result. If we call the toList function, and then we need to call grd departments dot, call the data bind method. That's it. There's no loop. There's no need to specify what to do in every row and every column. And as Rob pointed out, all of the back-end code so we wrote 5 lines of code that we did here in 20 to 30 lines. So now if we build our solution, now we may get one error here, we'll see. We may need one more reference. If we build our solution and click on our departments page again in our browser, we should get the 4 departments being displayed in our grid. So I'm just going to build this and try it. Let's go back here. Okay, well, I have a few extra departments in my database. Doesn't really matter. I think maybe other people executed the same query in my database. So we wrote way, way less code calling entity framework. Now, it's a fair bit of work to create that data model at first, but now I don't have to do it again. For all of my other queries in my whole project, our code can be as light as this. Connect and run a link query. So now we should have some data showing up. Now it auto-generated the columns as well. I may not always want to do this. In fact, usually I won't. Usually I'm going to want to customize the columns a bit. For example, I don't like that it says department ID without a space in it. It's not a very friendly column heading. Or maybe I don't want users to see the ID numbers. So by default, when we put on a grid, those columns are automatically generated. I can turn that off and I can manually add the columns the way I want to. So in my grid view tag, I'm going to add the property auto generate columns equals false. So I'm going to put the columns in manually because that way I can format them the way that we want to. If I save that and refresh my page, the grid's going to be blank. If the columns aren't auto-generated and we haven't manually put any in, there's no data. So my query is going to run, but nothing's going to show up. If I want to put my columns in manually, I put in a columns tag. In here, I'm going to use, we can see the different kinds of columns that are available. So we can put button columns, checkboxes, links, images, or if we just want a column to display one field from our query, we pick this ASP bound field. And I'll set the first one, the data field is department ID. In my header, I maybe just want it to say ID. Now, if I refresh my page, I'm just going to see the ID numbers. I'm going to have one column only. I'm going to add the other columns. My second data field is name. But I want to customize the heading and have it say department name. I also want one last one, and yes, I know we're about due for a break. Our data field is budget. The other reason I don't want to use the auto-generate columns is the budget will display right now just as a number. We probably want to format that as currency. So we can add formatting into this column and have it display as currency. Just go back for a minute and check it. So we've customized the column names this way. And if I want to customize the budget, if I pick the data format string property, if I use this little format option, it should show our budget as a currency value instead of just a regular number. So we're neatly, again, separating our presentation and our logic. Our C# code runs the query, fetches the data, passes it to our page, and our page has all the HTML for presentation. I'm just going to check and make sure this currency formatting is right. I think so. Yep, so now we get it as currency. So if we want to add links, buttons, other things in each row, we just add those as extra columns in our grid. We'll do that eventually in a couple weeks after reading week. We'll add an edit link and a delete link. And then we'll write the code in our C# file, what should happen when the user clicks edit or delete. We'll use the entity framework to do an edit or do a delete. So this is a very different way of putting our web application together from what we're used to doing with PHP. We have a lot more automation here, and we can write a lot less code. I know this is new, probably brand new for everybody. Probably nobody's seen this before, at least not with these tools. That's okay. Today's the introduction. And you will get a chance to practice this on your own for lab 2. So here's what we're going to do. It's 5 to 10. I'm going to step out for a couple minutes. We're going to take a 10-minute break. When we come back, we're going to build one more page. We're going to add a link here that says add a department. We're going to build a form, just a standard. We'll build a standard ASP.NET form using ASP text boxes and an ASP button. And when we submit the form, we want to use Entity Framework to create a new department in the database. And then we want to redirect the user back to this page so we can see that new department at the bottom of our department list. So then we can read data and we can create data. Yep, I will push it to get now. Sure thing. So let's take a break here.